In a small house on the outskirts of town, a young girl named Dinda was celebrating her 8th birthday. Though the party was simple, her smile never faded. As the food was nearly finished, her mother brought out a birthday cake with lit candles, while her father carried a large box wrapped in red paper. After blowing out the candles, Dinda eagerly unwrapped the gift. Inside was a porcelain doll wearing a long white dress, with golden curly hair and bright blue eyes that seemed almost alive. The doll looked old yet remarkably well kept. Its face was so intricately detailed that it appeared to have a subtle, unnatural expression. That night, Dinda placed the doll on a small chair in the corner of her room. She stared at it briefly before turning off the lights. The darkened room was dimly lit by the faint glow of the window, and the doll's shadow fell across the floor, creating a shape that didn't entirely match its form. As the night deepened, the sound of rain tapping against the window was joined by the faint creak of small footsteps on the wooden floor. Though faint, the noise was clear enough to wake Dinda. She slowly opened her eyes and looked toward the chair where the doll had been placed. The chair was empty. The doll was gone. Dinda's breathing quickened. She turned her head to the right and, at the edge of her bed, she saw something. The golden curls peeked out from the side of her mattress. The doll's bright blue eyes were now very close, staring directly at her. The doll stood upright on the floor, though it had never been able to stand unsupported before. Dinda's eyes locked onto the doll, unable to blink. Time seemed to slow, and her body was frozen as if bound by an invisible fear. The doll remained motionless, but the atmosphere in the room had shifted. The air grew colder, and an eerie sensation crawled over her skin. When morning arrived, there was no sign that anything unusual had occurred during the night. Yet, deep down, she knew that what she experienced was no illusion. The following nights brought little rest for Dinda. Each time she turned off the lights, the room felt heavier, as if the shadows themselves were alive. The doll, though motionless during the day, seemed to command a silent presence in the darkness. On the second night, Dinda woke up to the sound of soft, rhythmic tapping. Her heart pounded as she tried to locate the source. The noise was coming from her desk, where the doll now sat, its porcelain hand resting against the wooden surface. It had moved, though no one else had entered the room. The tapping stopped as soon as Dinda sat up in her bed. The doll's glassy blue eyes seemed to catch the faint glow of moonlight, reflecting a faint, unnatural glint. Dinda avoided looking at the doll for the rest of the night, but she couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. She buried herself under the blanket, her breathing shallow, her hands trembling. Hours passed before she dared to peek out, only to find the doll's position slightly changed again, its head tilted, as if observing her. By the fourth night, strange occurrences became more frequent. Objects in Dinda's room were subtly misplaced. A hairbrush was found under her bed, though she swore she had left it on the dresser. The curtains shifted slightly, even when the windows were closed. The doll remained eerily still by day, but at night, it seemed to become something else entirely. Dinda's parents noticed her growing unease, but dismissed it as childish imagination. However, her mother couldn't deny a strange feeling whenever she entered Dinda's room. She often caught herself glancing at the doll, feeling as though its unblinking eyes followed her. On the fifth night, the air in Dinda's room felt colder than usual. She tried to fall asleep, but a faint scraping sound pulled her from the edge of slumber. Slowly, she turned her head toward the sound. The doll was no longer on the chair. Its silhouette was at the foot of her bed. Dinda froze, her throat dry and her chest tight. The doll's small hands seemed to clutch the edge of the blanket, and though its face was expressionless, Dinda could feel its intent. It wasn't just looking at her, it was waiting. When morning came, the doll was back on the chair, perfectly still. But on the floor, near the bed, faint scratches marred the wooden planks, as though tiny hands had clawed at the surface. Dinda didn't mention it to her parents, but she knew the truth. Luna wasn't just a doll. It was alive, and it was growing bolder. By the sixth day, Dinda's fear had grown unbearable. The scratches on the floor near her bed remained, and every night the doll seemed to edge closer, as if testing her limits. She avoided her room during the day, spending hours in the living room or the kitchen. But as night fell, she knew she had to return. The thought of sleeping with the doll nearby made her stomach churn. But no one believed her when she tried to explain. That evening, Dinda sat at the dinner table in silence, her appetite gone. Her parents noticed her pale face and hollow eyes, but reassured her that nothing was wrong. The doll, they insisted, was just a toy. Dinda wanted to believe them, but the fear buried deep in her chest told her otherwise. When it was time for bed, she reluctantly climbed under the covers. The doll remained on the chair, positioned perfectly as always, with its cold, blue eyes staring into the room. Dinda turned off the lights, her heart hammering in the silence. She kept the blanket pulled up to her chin, her gaze fixed on the dark outline of the doll. Sleep never came. At midnight, the room's atmosphere shifted. The air grew colder, and the faint sound of rustling fabric broke the stillness. Dinda's breath hitched as her eyes adjusted to the darkness. The doll was no longer on the chair. It was standing at the foot of her bed. Tears pricked Dinda's eyes as she lay frozen, unable to move. The doll stood unnaturally still, but its head was tilted, its lifeless eyes locking onto hers. Slowly, the doll began to climb onto the bed. Its porcelain hands gripped the blanket, and its small, jointed legs moved with a jerky, unnatural rhythm. Dinda wanted to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. She clutched the blanket, hoping it would protect her. But the doll continued its approach. It stopped just inches from her face, its icy stare boring into her soul. Then, in the silence of the room, a whisper echoed, a faint, chilling voice that seemed to come from nowhere yet everywhere. "You can't run." The whisper shattered Dinda's paralysis. With a surge of adrenaline, she threw the blanket off and bolted from the room. Her feet pounded against the cold floor as she sprinted to her parents' room. She banged on the door, crying and pleading for them to wake up. Her parents opened the door, startled by her terror. Between sobs, Dinda tried to explain what had happened, but they dismissed her again, frustrated by what they thought was another nightmare. Her father went to check the room to prove nothing was amiss. He returned moments later, holding the doll in his hands, saying it was just where she left it on the chair. Dinda shook her head violently, insisting it had moved, but her parents refused to listen. They placed the doll on the living room shelf, thinking it would calm her. That night, Dinda slept in her parents' room, clutching the blanket tightly. For the first time in days, she felt safe. The doll was far away, and she finally drifted into an uneasy sleep. But in the quiet of the living room, the doll began to move. Its tiny fingers curled and uncurled, its head twisting slightly as it surveyed the darkened space. The faint sound of porcelain scraping against wood echoed as the doll climbed down from the shelf. It walked slowly, its movements deliberate, as it made its way toward the hallway. The next morning, Dinda's parents found her bed empty, her blanket tossed to the floor. They searched the house, calling her name, but Dinda was nowhere to be found. The only clue was the doll, now sitting in the center of her bed, its glassy blue eyes staring blankly ahead. In its porcelain hand was a single strand of Dinda's hair, and the doll never slept again.